development. If you go back to like early stage when you had just a backend server, so you'd make a request to a server, it'd get information from a database, whatever, it would render or create markup out of that and then send that back to the browser. And you can have JavaScript that loaded on the front end. And then the next was single page applications. So this was like just send all the JavaScript that you'll ever need and then handle client side navigation. And we realized like, hey, that's a lot of JavaScript that we're sending on pages that we may not need it. And so we went through this phase of static site generation. Gatsby for me was the gateway into that. And it was like on Twitter at the time, everybody was recreating their site with Gatsby. And this was just looking at all your pages and saying like, hey, this is just content. Let's just create this at build time. And these will be just static pages that live on a CDN. And they're secure, they're fast, they're all these things. And then we realized basically like since then we've been circling on like, basically that's the number one goal is static first as much as we can. But how do we take advantage of like adding dynamic stuff? How do we do revalidation? There was incremental static regeneration with Next.js, which was basically the idea of like, if we're building static pages for a huge site, maybe we don't want to build them all.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Modern Web Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Osell, VP of Innovation at This.Labs. Today, excited to be joined by my co-host, Adam Rakis. Adam, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And of course, Danny Thompson. Danny, how are you doing?
Amazing as always. I'm very happy we have James Q. Quick here, and he has a very personal place in my heart, so I'm excited for this episode today.
Well, spoiler alert, Danny. Yes, as you just heard, we are being joined today by James Q. Quick, one of the few people in tech who we have to remember all of the parts of the name. James is the head of developer experience at Makeswift. James, how are you doing?
Hey, good. I'll be honest, I feel like super obnoxious having the middle initial. I don't know if I've like told you all, but it's an SEO thing because there was a football player named James Quick. So to compete with that, I like and handles are unique across all socials. So James Q Quick everywhere. So anyway, I feel obnoxious. I feel like kind of, but I do try to stay consistent with the middle initial.
Hey, it's better this than than like a David Korshid with David K Piano. Everybody just thinks his name's David Piano.
Yeah.
So you went the right way with it.
Yep.
All right. Listen, we have you here. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different things. First thing we're going to be talking about, though, is Next.js, right? Big topic. We just had NextConf. You were at NextConf to hear the announcements, to do a talk yourself. And so I was just kind of curious if you could kind of give us an intro of your takeaways from the event. Any of the big announcements, things that were talked about, things that caught your eye that people should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I'll do one like small correction. I didn't actually speak. I was just an attendee, which is an awkward thing for me. Like I almost never go to conferences if I'm not speaking. So it's kind of cool to like just be there. And not
this
have
is
to
becoming.
worry
If this was
speaking.
the event, why didn't everybody tell me? Apparently, everybody just went to this event to hang out.
Everybody was there. Yeah, it was fun.
Okay.
Which I think that was my biggest takeaway. Like all the people that were there that I know online that I've met or not in person, getting to have that in person time is like one of the most invaluable things. In general. And then like from an announcements perspective, honestly, I feel like there really wasn't much. There's a whole section on caching, which I think was the big thing, like new caching APIs. And we could talk more about that in depth if we wanted to, but it's kind of, I think the biggest struggle for me is like how much the opinion from Next.js on how we do caching has changed in the last year. So 14, there was like all this aggressive caching that they did by default. 15, they backed away from that. And then now they have these completely different caching APIs, which give like different levels of granularity on what and how you cache, which solves some issues that like you just didn't have an answer for in the past. But that was the biggest thing. So personally, I haven't like played around with those APIs. There was like some stuff around stability and like readiness of TurboPack, but really nothing big, or at least nothing like really game changing. So caching was
so when you were sitting there maybe and listening to the keynote, did you have like what was on your bingo card? Like, were there things that you were expecting to hear that you didn't hear? Did this one completely come out of left field for you?
The caching definitely came, like the new caching API definitely came out of left field for me. I didn't expect anything like that at all. And again, it's a big shift from like how you like the exported variables that you would use to do caching previously, which you can still use, by the way, versus like the directives and things that they've added in this new caching world. So I wasn't expecting that at all. I was really hoping to hear something around PPR. They didn't really talk much about that, at least in terms of stability that I could see. And I didn't go to all the talks, so I don't know if there were some things in there that I missed. But I was thinking that would be like a bigger focus. But maybe it's just not.
Do you want to define that a little bit more for the people that maybe aren't familiar with that acronym?
Yeah, PPR is what is the first P?
Partial pre-rendering.
Thank you. Partial
yeah.
pre-rendering. So the big thing with like server components in general is you can run logic on the server, you can query a database in the server, render a React component, and that just gets sent down to the browser. And there's this whole idea of like using React Suspense either directly or underneath the hood with Next.js. And what it does is it like kicks off the loading of that asynchronous data on the server. It sends some HTML to the browser with like a loading skeleton, for example. And then as that data is ready, it streams it in. And that's really cool. And it like changes a lot of how we think about building applications and how we build individual components. But the key thing with that is if you leverage server components without some of the caching that we may or may not talk more about, but if you're not doing caching and you do use server components, that means that entire route is going to be server rendered. So to get that entire route, it's going to go all the way to the server that's hosted in one central data center, probably US East by default. Partial pre-rendering, though, is the ability to take like that same page in theory and create it as a static page, which gets replicated to a CDN all across the world. And this is basically the goal of like everything that we build is like, how do we get the most amount of things on a CDN? So that means like if I'm in Japan and I query this page, I'm going to get a data center in Europe. If I'm in, in Asia, if I'm in Europe, it'll go to a data center in Europe, US, the same thing. And with PPR, you get the ability to like have that static page and replicate that across the world on a CDN. And then it has these little spots inside of it for dynamic content. And so it uses the same server components and streaming, but it's only streaming for those individual pieces while the shell of that page is served from a CDN. And that is like, that's really like, we've had a lot of hype around server components. I think we kind of overlooked the fact that that locks you in on a route basis to going all the way to a one data center. Now with PPR, Astro has a similar feature too, which is really cool. That I think really changes the game of like combining all the things that we did when we went like static first and static site generators. Like the reason we did that, we get to combine that now with super dynamic experiences. And I think it's pretty exciting.
So, you kind of alluded to some of the aspects of server components, right? So from your perspective, how has the shift towards server components in Next.js changed your approach towards building web applications? I know we've heard quite a few takes, especially on the podcast with it. I know we've talked about it a couple times, but I'm very interested from your perspective, like how are you utilizing them? What use cases, and maybe has it shifted, which I'm sure it has to a certain degree, your approach towards some of the applications that you're building?
Yeah, I think I think we first still have this idea of static first. And so if we go back to like, I've given a few talks on kind of the history of web development. If you go back to like early stage when you had just a backend server, so you'd make a request to a server, it'd get information from a database, whatever. It would render or create markup out of that and then send that back to the browser. And you can have JavaScript that loaded on the front end. And then the next was single page applications. So this was like just send all the JavaScript that you'll ever need and then handle client side navigation. And we realized like, hey, that's a lot of JavaScript that we're sending on pages that we may not need it. And so we went through this phase of static site generation. Gatsby for me was the gateway into that. And it was like on Twitter at the time, everybody was recreating their site with Gatsby. And this was just looking at all your pages and saying like, hey, this is just content. Let's just create this at build time. And these will be just static pages that live on a CDN and they're secure, they're fast, they're all these things. And then we realized basically like since then we've been circling on like, basically that's the number one goal is static first as much as we can. But how do we take advantage of like adding dynamic stuff? How do we do revalidation? There was incremental static regeneration with Next.js, which was basically the idea of like, if we're building static pages for a huge site, maybe we don't want to build them all. Maybe we do the top 10, 15, 20, 50 pages. And then as requests come in for those other pages, we build those on demand. And so there's been all these different ways that we kind of think about like, how do we incorporate dynamicness, but also get static anytime we can. So there's a lot of caching stuff built into Next.js. They do caching on routes by default. This has now changed between 14 and 15, but caching on like fetch requests that you make to load data and some other things. And so with server components, like on a surface level, you're doing a bunch of stuff on the server, but oftentimes that stuff is going to get cached and then it's basically just a static page anyway. So server components are going to be great for things that are a little bit more dynamic. And going back to the PPR example, like you have, I think the standard example that you'll see on the Next.js website is like you have a nav bar, for example, And inside of that nav bar, you have like a store cart icon. And that icon has like a badge that shows like, hey, you have two things in your cart, for example. Well, that entire nav bar is completely static except for like that little badge. So that's a perfect example of like we'll ship this like fully static nav bar, and maybe the rest of the page is static as well. But then this one little piece is dynamic, and we can actually do that from the server. So anyway, for me, it's kind of like I've just kind of gone all in on server components, and this relevant project for me was my Deals for Devs project, which started of just like listing Black Friday deals for developers, and then updated like different versions of Next.js, use server components, tried out caching, like all the things that they've talked about in the last year and a half or so. And that's been a cool learning experience. I think there's still a lot of like education around server components. I think there's still a lot of like finalizing the PPR being in a stable place, like understanding PPR and really, I don't know, like the whole understanding of the ecosystem and the rendering strategies, because they get more and more overwhelming every day. I think there's a lot of education around that, but I think server components in general, for me, have worked out really well and are just pretty exciting.
James, you mentioned revalidation. That's been an area that I have had some struggles with, mainly because of the kinds of applications I build. Maybe also it's a skill issue on my part, entirely possible. But with the way RSC works, well, actually, server actions, when you want to start to change some of the data that you're showing, you'll use a server action, and then you'll probably call revalidate tag. And that doesn't just refetch the thing that you revalidated. It re-renders the entire RSC tree. It just revalidates the cache entry for the tag that you gave it. So if you have so you basically have to cache everything or deal with it always being reloaded when you revalidate anything. Are those sorts of things that you've ever run across with the types of things you build? This doesn't come up with e-commerce or with blogs. It's not a concern. Yeah. This is more for like dashboards with lots of data sources.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll answer your specific question, but I will give a like perspective I think that's relevant to that, which is like the way I think about my data being valid has really changed with the ability to call revalidate tag and revalidate path. And what I've kind of flipped my head, and I don't know if other people think this way already or not, but I've kind of flipped my head to think about like exactly your point. Like from a server action perspective, what actions can the user take that then change data? And then where is that data then needing to be reflected? And that, like, if you kind of change your mindset to think about that in every instance, then you have the ability to like backtrack to say, okay, I need to revalidate tag, path, et cetera, to get the latest data as changes happen. I think one important aspect of that too is the default caching for routes. So a whole route by default are going to be static still. You automatically opt out of that if you use something like cookies or headers or route parameters, things like that. So if you have routes that leverage route parameters, and you can think about a dynamic route like /blog /myfirstblog, you probably have a template page for like route and then like slug inside of it. So that's going to kind of get data, unless you configure it, that's going to refresh its data from the server basically every time. And you can configure that too. So anyway, like I think about, especially from an admin dashboard, it's just every interaction that takes place, like where is that data then displayed? An example for me in Deals for Devs is I have like feature deals on the homepage. I also have the deal like individual page for all the deal details. And so if I think about me as an admin going in and updating the individual deal, when I save that, I then need to potentially check to see if this was featured and now is not featured, or it wasn't featured and is now featured. And if either one of those is the case, I need to go and update revalidate path on the homepage for the feature deals. I also then, with any of those changes, need to go and revalidate the path for the individual listing page. So anyway, I'm not sure if that answers like your specific question, but I think just the mindset of thinking about all the interactions that can take place and how they affect data and where it lives, then I think helps like influence. I know where I need to go to be able to update the data that's out there.
For sure. It sounds like you own all your own data and you're not depending on any sort of external services, which is a really good place to be. And this problem that I mentioned doesn't come up if that's the case, and you're in a really happy place.
So your specific issue is like referencing data that lives elsewhere?
if you ever need to depend on external services that may not be as fast as you like, that you don't control and you don't know when they change, now you can't really cache them, and they're going to always call anytime you revalidate anything. And now you're going to be faced with some performance questions that you'll have to come up with some creative answers to.
So you're like fetch requests. If you're doing, and I think this is one of the limitations with caching before these new cache headers, because you had the ability to cache fetch requests. So, but only fetch requests that happen on the server. And this is not very well documented on Next.js. And it's kind of frustrating, to be honest, because it like, you really have to get into the details to understand it. But you can cache fetch requests that happen on the server. So if you're making a fetch request, but only very specifically a fetch request, you can cache requests to an outside API, and then you can determine how and when you want to bust that cache too. They also had the unstable cache, which is the ability to basically like unstably cache a function of yours on the server, which inside of that function, you could use an SDK to not make a fetch request directly, but use an SDK that then makes a fetch request basically behind the scenes and get that cache. Now, with the, like my understanding with these new directives, and I haven't done this in depth myself, but those directives can be applied within a given function or within a specific call. I guess a specific function. So it actually replaces what was the need for unstable cache to now have the ability to cache these functions that are not dependent upon a fetch request specifically, if that makes sense.
Sure. Lots of options.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we have more of this conversation to come, but first we'd like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, your partner in modern web development and consulting. At This.Labs, we specialize in empowering businesses to reach their full potential through technology. We understand that in today's fast-paced tech environment, adaptability and efficiency are crucial. That's why we offer tailored solutions designed to meet your unique challenges and objectives, and our commitment to excellence and client success sets us apart as a trusted advisor in the industry. Discover how This.Labs can transform your business. Visit us at this.co to learn more about our services and how we can help you stay ahead in this competitive landscape. Thanks to This.Labs and my team for allowing us to for sponsoring this episode and allowing us to have these kinds of conversations, and for their dedication to advancing the developer community. All right, back to our conversation. James, I kind of want to pick up kind of where we left off there, which is this idea of like, there's a lot to learn. I think with Next.js, and so I know you do like content as well, a lot in the education space. So I'm sure you're interfacing with people that are just learning Next.js or using it for the first time all over the place. My question is, what is the state of education with Next.js right now? It's like, for example, like I've worked with teams and they like show me their Next code, and I'm like, oh, like you've written all of your fetch code is in the front end. Like you've just basically written a React app that you're serving from Vercel. Like it's not, it's not actually a Next app at all. And I'm sure that's not uncommon. People don't realize that they're not following kind of the patterns and the strategies of Next.js. So what do you think the state of kind of this is for people? Like, is it just we need to give people time to fully tick over? Or is there something that is difficult for people to realize if they're doing it wrong?
So there's like, from a difficulty perspective, we've historically in the past had a pretty clean separation of front end and back end. Like even with single page applications, right? Like you had your back end server, which is probably just an API server. And then you had a front end in React. And the way it worked, to your point, is you'd load up the front end, you'd make fetch requests to the back end to get data, you'd make fetch requests to then mutate data, or you'd use graphic, like whatever you used. And so now with Next.js and other frameworks have similar like mixing of front end and back end, all this stuff is tied together. Even before considering the fact that we have server components now where you can write SQL queries right inside of a React component. So being able to tease apart when and where things run on the server versus the client has never been more difficult than it is right now. I think another thing with Next.js, if we look at the last 2 years, and if we were to sit down and look at all the things that have changed, like within the last 2 years, we've gone from basically no React server components, and we had like get server side props and get static props or whatever. And those are pretty clean. For me, coming from a Gatsby background where you had to use GraphQL and you had to be these other like integration points, just having two functions that I could call that were very explicit. This runs on the server, this runs like statically at build time on the server. That was very clear. And if we look at like from that point, even like a year or two ago of that kind of being the default to now having server actions, which mixes again, like you can run SQL in a React component, which is super weird. You have server versus client components, which is still tricky. You can't render a server component inside of a client component unless you pass it as a child. Like there's all these things that are really detailed. And then, like I said about caching, like we kind of had caching for the last year or so with 14 and then 15. And it was done a certain way, and there were some changes that happened between 14 and 15. And then now with these new APIs that will go into 15, it's a completely different mechanism for handling caching. And so I think not only do we have the issue of like mixing and teasing apart front end versus back end, not to mention also client components run on the server, like first render happens on the server too. Like this, it gets infinitely confusing. So not only do we have that, we also have the fact that like the best practice in Next.js depends on a 6-month increment. Like 6 months ago, how you did things is different than how you do it now. 6 months before that was different. So it's like, how do you teach that? And especially like for me as a content creator and not doing production software, that's kind of fun and cool, right? Like I get to create videos on like the new stuff, and I've got this app that like no one uses, and it's fine if I break shit, that's fine. But if you're a real developer, like working on a real product, you can't just adopt a new version and a new paradigm every 6 months. So I think from an education perspective, it's almost like you have to be very specific about who the audience is to know where to start. And so some people are looking for content of like, what's the latest and greatest? But the reality is, I bet that a lot of people who are writing bigger Next.js applications aren't doing 14, 15. They're probably not doing server components. So I think that's a very significant challenge is like, what stage are people at? How quickly can they, as individual developers and as a team of developers at a company, how quickly can they move and adopt? And that drastically changes the version of Next.js and the code that they write. And then to your point, like you were saying, like people basically just use Next.js to do a React application. That's actually fine too. Like you still get some things from Next.js out of the box that React by itself wouldn't give you. But there is a whole nother world of things that you can take advantage of in the Next.js ecosystem.
Yeah. So, what's interesting, and I have a little bit of a hot take here, so I'm kind of curious to get your take on it. I've been thinking about why I think that this has been difficult to pick up, because it's difficult to remember back at the beginning of React. At the beginning of React, people have to remember that we like two-way bindings was like the way it happened. Like AngularJS was making that so popular. So everything was just like two-way bindings. Everything was live. As soon as you update the variable, it's in the place. And React introduced this challenging notion of like renders, the different render cycles, and getting used to that framework. That took a while for people to get up to speed on. I think people nowadays take for granted how weird that was to get your head around when React first came out. In that way, I think similarly, React server components, in the way that Next is kind of formulating itself, needs time for people to move their brains over. But what's different about it, in my opinion, is that when you go back to like the Jamstack, the static site stuff that was really popular, I think the architecture of that made a lot of intuitive sense, that you just had these functions that accumulated the data, then functions that transformed the data, and then functions that turned it into, content. And I think that just made sense, right? I think similarly, something like a Remix, they went kind of all in on trying to make the fundamentals at the base of that be the form, like real platform things. Say what you will about other decisions they made or whatever else. I think that felt like, oh, if I learn Remix, I'm going to be learning the platform plus Remix. And I think what's been interesting is Next kind of feels like you're learning Next. And I think we'll still be better for it once people's heads move over to the new thing. But I'm curious if you believe that there's some truth to this idea that maybe this is the most popular, or at least recently the most popular, that one of these kind of like configuration by convention type of frameworks has gotten so big. And, and I think some people still just have heartburn. They're like, am I learning how to be a better web developer? Am I learning to be a better Next developer?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of different ways we could take this. One, like, kind of fun route is you could almost argue that those core fundamentals, like platform APIs that Remix really embraces, people didn't know them regardless for the last couple of years because we've abstracted away from them. Like if we just look at forms, I can't tell you the resurgence of like here's what forums can do content on YouTube, because people that have learned recently have no idea. They've only done React, and they maintain state, and they send a fetch request, and they show a loading state, and they get back data, and they show an error message if there is one, or they like show a success message. Like, people, I can't tell you how many like memes and stuff I've seen of like, oh, forums can do that. So I would argue like a lot of people don't know that they exist regardless. So it's not like they realized they were missing something with Next.js. I think also for the benefit of Remix, of teaching you the core fundamentals, which I am a big fan of, for that benefit to be truly real, those learnings then have to like carry over to other frameworks as well. So if Remix is the only one that's fully embracing the web platform, then me learning the web platform doesn't necessarily serve me as well when I go somewhere else, if that makes sense. Now, it gives you a better understanding, a solid understanding. Agree with that completely. I'll always say start with JavaScript, then go into React. That's always been my opinion. I think you have to know like the basics of JavaScript, or you should, and then layer on top of that. But I think one other point you mentioned was just like time on Next.js. The thing that I'm really worried about is like, yeah, we could give people time to learn about server components, but given how much has changed overall in the last year, how much is going to change in the next year? So if that means in the next year, that's another year for people to learn server components, does that also mean we've introduced something completely different? That's my worry, is like time doesn't necessarily imply it's all dedicated time to learn a certain thing. Like the goalpost keeps moving with all the features and things that come out. So that's kind of my concern, is just how quickly things change and how much it changes within that within those time periods.
You made a really good point about portability to other frameworks. I can tell you SvelteKit absolutely uses forms. Forms are just a great portal to the server, and so that's what these meta frameworks do, is they add server-side abilities to your app. And so the form is sort of that portal, but each framework is going to have its own little bits to add the JavaScript to make it a purely client-side transition when JavaScript's enabled. Otherwise, it'll still work without JavaScript. It'll do a full page load. Yep. I did want to ask you real quick, have you looked at TanStack Start at all? Because that is a completely new model, which I'm extremely excited about.
Yeah, I haven't. So I'll kind of let y'all carry the conversation there. I've just heard several people say the same thing. So I haven't looked at it myself, but I know there's a lot of people that are super excited about it.
I'll give just a taste, and Danny's excited too. Let him give a taste, and then I think we're at our end. So Next and Remix and SvelteKit, they all are kind of very server-centric, where you have this server-side layer and it sort of emits a client-side page. I'm not being very articulate, but the cool thing about TanStack Start is you start with like a client-side SPA, fully client-side app, with TanStack Router, which is just a SPA framework, and it just adds a very thin server layer on top of it. All the loaders are isomorphic, which simplifies a lot of things. It simplifies a lot of the data revalidation stuff, and it just adds that server layer just for that first render, and everything else after that server render continues to work client-side, and of course it gives you server actions and API routes. And so that, I think, is going to simplify a lot of things, and I'm really excited to see Tanner ship that. Danny, is that about what you're excited about?
You've definitely done a good job explaining a big part of it. And if James or somebody listening has not been familiar with TanStack Start, I actually got to interview Tanner Lindsley at Epic Web Camp, and that video is fully dedicated to his journey on building TanStack Start. Really cool episode, if I'm being honest. But he blew my mind multiple times in that episode, but also in conversations that we had before and afterwards. And the one thing that I even, for those listening that may not know, we have like a little chat on the side. And I literally said at one point earlier that TanStack Start will solve this issue. It's in regards to when it caches something or re-renders something, it's re-rendering the entire tree and page. With TanStack Start, his idea is instead of re-rendering the entire tree and page, it will just re-render that one part of the tree. And so that is the big difference, and not just from a performance aspect, from a developer aspect of re-rendering all that information. Performance is just going to go up. It's going to become a lot easier to kind of deal with some of the information on the pages. Tanner's definitely killing it as far as the idea and the execution. So I'm a big fan of it. And I think I probably would have been regardless, because I'm a huge fan of TanStack Start. I mean TanStack Query. I've even done a talk on that. But this is definitely some next level stuff, and he's gone full time on it. So he's like dedicating all of his thoughts on how to just improved TanStack start. And I'm excited to see where it goes. I think a lot of people are going to end up adopting it, if I'm being completely honest with you. But I kind of wanted to move the conversation in a different direction. And the reason why is you are now at Makeswift. And I was one of the lucky people to kind of be there when the conversation started with you even thinking about going to Makeswift. So I'm personally slightly curious, but also we can kind of, maybe ask this for the podcast itself. Number one, what is Makeswift? And what attracted you to join Makeswift? And what are you basically, maybe what are problems that you're trying to address and solve with it?
Yeah. So Makeswift itself is a visual builder, and you can really start there. And it's a visual builder made for marketers. So it's the non-technical user experience that is the core focus of Makeswift. And so inside of Makeswift, you can create pages, routes. You can have like built-in components that you can drag and drop. You can do basic styles like margin and padding, and you can do layouts and grid systems and that sort of stuff. Probably a lot of things that we would expect. The cool thing for me, and I think the other aspect of the product, is it also integrates with Next.js. So you can start with like just inside of Makeswift, they actually do like a default host for you. So like you can just say, create a site, it's hosted for you. You can make changes, you can publish, you can drag and drop, etc. If you want to do anything custom with that from a code perspective, then you can go and have a custom host, which is where you're creating your own Next.js application. You integrate it with Makeswift with a couple of different configuration things. And then you can take React components and you can basically call Makeswift.register component. And that takes that component and makes it available inside of the visual builder. And that you can then drag that around. The other thing that you can do with that is when you register that component, you can register it to have inputs as well. So if you wanted to like build an accordion or something, you can register an accordion component that is defined inside of React and has all the styles and stuff. And you can define your React component to accept the like items that go inside of the accordion, and then say when you register the component, have that be an input, an array of inputs that you can use from the builder inside of the visual builder to then determine what content goes inside of that accordion. And then with that, you can do anything else in Next.js. So if you want to consume some other API, or if you want to get data from a headless CMS or a database, or like whatever else you want to do, you can do inside of Next.js world and surface that inside of Makeswift in whichever way makes possible. The interesting thing, Makeswift itself, we are a team of like 15, so it's got that like really small startup vibe. They also were acquired almost exactly a year ago by BigCommerce. So we have this like really small startup, cool vibe that I really enjoy, moves really fast. And then we also have kind of the support of a bigger company in BigCommerce financially, and then just like from a bigger team perspective. And so for me, like this was an opportunity to be head of developer experience, where I get to kind of build out what I think that is, ideally in the next year or two, build out a team around that. I think there's also some exciting aspects of like developer experience is kind of a newer thing for BigCommerce. And I think they've got a lot to figure out about how they do it and what that looks like. And I think there's an opportunity for me to play a part in shaping that as well. So I think from a visibility perspective inside of a bigger company, that's a plus for me in my career. But I think just product is pretty exciting. And like, I don't know how many people in general have heard of Makeswift at this point, but with this being combined with BigCommerce, who already has a massive audience of customers and that sort of stuff, and we're working on integrations to work with BigCommerce and Makeswift directly, that means that we're going to have access to like our product being in front of and kind of the default experience for a lot of customers going forward. And that's really exciting to like see how customers are actually building, get feedback from them, implement that in the product, et cetera. So anyway, product, team, overall, like startup feel, bigger company support. And I got to talk, Danny, like you saw, with several of them in person at Render, and just really enjoyed the team. So,
I mean, other than just the popularity and the market share, are there particular benefits that y'all get by building on top of Next.js for your clients?
Yeah, it's kind of the age-old question of the balance between developers and marketers, right? And if you look at headless CMSs, they've all kind of gone through this transition of headless CMSs. When they started, they really just gave you a way to author data. And then they started looking at, well, hey, like if we wanted to make a change to the site, that means we have to get a developer involved just to add padding somewhere or something like that. So you see a lot of these headless CMSs now have some concept of a visual builder. And I think they started from the headless CMS perspective first and moved into a little bit of visual stuff, versus Makeswift really started with the visual piece and making sure that that's a first class product for marketing and non-technical people. But again, like it's the combination of Next.js. It's popular, it's growing, it's continuing to grow, it's best practices, it's all these new features, it's kind of exciting, blah, blah, blah. And as a developer, you can incorporate anything that's missing from the platform. And if you go back to something like WordPress is great because it has so many direct integrations and marketplaces and themes and stuff. But the key for WordPress, for people that really build on it, is they're going into the code and building themselves, right? So it has this really great CMS perspective. It has this really great, like, non-technical people can go in and create pages and author content and stuff. But the real power of WordPress as a platform is being able to go in underneath the hood when and if you need to, and be able to customize whatever you want. So I think we have the ability to do that, but now with a framework in Next.js, that's a lot more exciting. It's doing a lot more like innovative things. There's a lot more going on. And it's the ecosystem that I've been a part of for the last couple of years. So that is particularly exciting for me, just to dive deeper into Next.js, to see how people are implementing it, to see what cool things people are doing. But short answer to your question, combination of like great marketing authoring experience, and then the ability from a technical perspective to do and fill any gaps that we need to.
I love how it has that sort of like a telescope pointed into a telescope type of effects too, because, some people, one of the things that people like about Next is just that it makes that deployment and, internals, sort of your DevOps whole thing system much easier to build, much more straightforward, at least to get off the ground, and then give you that customization flexibility from there, right? You don't have to go directly to AWS. You don't have to self-host or whatever else. And so I love this idea that you can kind of have that same effect, that low code or even no code experience from the front end, and then that deploys to a relatively low code deployment strategy with like Next.js and potentially with like Vercel or something. And, how much that's going to multiply a relatively small team of people to deliver something a bit outsized for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just enabling both sides, marketers, non-technical people, and technical people, to do their job and not be super dependent upon each other. I think that's kind of the clean divide and what it really offers.
Okay, awesome. Well, listen, for people that are interested in finding out more, can you let them know where to find either Makeswift or yourself online?
Yeah, Makeswift at makeswift.com. And then for myself personally, James Q Quick. We talked about this at the beginning of the episode, across many platforms. Twitter is probably the one I spend the most time on. So James Q Quick on Twitter.
Wonderful. Well, that's going to be it for us today. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. Thanks, of course, to our guest, James. As always, we say the conversation does not stop here. You can find James on Twitter, as we just heard, at James Q Quick. You can find me online at Robocell. As for Adam, you can find him online at Adam Rakis. And Danny, you can find online at D Thompson Dev. And as we wrap up, we would just like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, one last time, who would like me to remind you that sometimes it's hard to bridge the gap between business objectives and tech implementation, and it can get messy. This. Is trusted by names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile, and they love helping business leaders fulfill their strategic digital initiatives. Check them out at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. All right, thanks, everybody. See y'all next time.